Welcome, everyone. I'm Lauren Hawkins. Thanks for tuning in with us to Spirituality Adventures. We are so glad you're here, and we're very excited about the content we get to share with you through our blogs and podcasts. Spirituality Adventures is made possible by your support. One way you can support us is by liking, following, subscribing, or sharing any of these podcasts or blogs that you like. Another way you can support us is by going to our website, www.spiritualityadventures.com. There you can click the support tab and you can sign up for a monthly subscription or a one-time gift. We appreciate all your support. Now here's Fred.
Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality. And today we are excited to have Calvin Arsenia visiting with us today. Thank you, Calvin, for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Calvin and I have known each other for a total of maybe 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Short period of time. I have a friend that follows what I do, and I'm on this series called Creativity and Spirituality. And so I'm interviewing musicians and artists of various kinds, and my friend says, you need to meet Calvin. Actually, what he was originally saying was you and Calvin should do an event together. So I started going, okay, well, how do I get connected to Calvin? And because I didn't know, I didn't know you hadn't followed your career. And then it turns out, I think we had more connections than just that. So my friend has a couple of close friends. He's a rock climber, and I think a couple of guys that you know. And then I found out that there was a little bit of connection from your past with some vineyard connection,
Yep.
And so that really intrigued me. So I was really just thinking about your music and your artistry and performance and all that. But I always try to check out as much information on people as I can, which led me to your podcast. And I think you might have mentioned this to me when we've had a couple of conversations now. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the podcast that you do with your friend Justin called We Were Christian Kids. And so to my audience, why don't you first give a little bit of background in terms of your growing up in the church in Kansas City, particularly Olathe, and then how you came to do the podcast, We Were Christian Kids.
Wow. Well, it all started in a little town in Kansas called Olathe, and my family had moved there after we all survived Y2K, and my mom moved our family to the area for Sprint. She worked at Sprint, and they transferred us from Central Virginia. And so we found ourselves connected in different churches in the area when I was young, 10, 11, 12, 13. And I started, over the years, got more and more involved, picked up a guitar and was immediately put on stage and singing songs for the youth services and different Bible studies throughout the week. And I discovered a deep love for worship music and for the worship experience and sharing music and vulnerability. And I became very, I wouldn't say addicted, but I would say adjusted to that feeling. So then I found myself in different kind of worship environments all around the city, worship nights and prayer meetings, and then I was involved in with the International House of Prayer, and did some training with them, and then hosted my own prayer meetings and worship nights. But kind of what my goal all the time was to not just be serving one specific kind of Christian, but instead to be inviting every kind of Christian. If we all honor Jesus and if we all honor God, then why can't we share space, even if our worship looks different? And so I wanted to build communities that were kind of parachurch communities inside the church, inside our schools, and also at different events throughout the week. And so that kind of naturally progressed into me going on a missions trip with my worship team when I was 20. And we were charged and felt compelled and called to go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and to serve as a band, kind of a covert operation. We were a rock band playing love songs, and I played keys for that band. And we were there for 2 weeks the first time. Then I went back the following year, another 2-week trip. And on that trip, I was invited to be the worship minister for the church that we were serving in Edinburgh, and also which was a kind of a missional community. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, but maybe some of your listeners aren't. But the missional mindset would be that we're not trying to put butts in seats in our services, but instead that we are trying to bring the kingdom into our normal, regular, natural environments and the things that we are naturally drawn to. And so there was a one member of our congregation, our very small but fiery congregation, and she did salsa dancing, and that was her outreach. And then another person had a poker night with friends in the neighborhood, and that was his outreach. And I served, quote unquote served, but also it was a very real connection to other humans by going to all the open mic nights that I could go to and just talking to people and hearing their story and trying to see how could I help facilitate them finding, realizing, and fulfilling their dreams. And in that process, it was the first time that I'd ever left home. And so therefore it's very formative for me, because I also had a lot of freedom to think and to meet people who had other kinds of thoughts and to ask some big questions in a way that allowed me to come up with some of my own conclusions. And I felt this lifelong burden of shame attached to my sexuality that I remember very specifically praying to God. I said, I know you don't want me to hate myself. I know that. And I know that you don't hate me, but all the time the equation turns out where I hate me, and this isn't working anymore. And I was, very depressed, not clinically, but I was just sad all the time. And then I saw some other things that were happening within the church community, not only the one that I was serving in Edinburgh, but also the ones that I'd come from, that I felt was not an effective way to call people into their fullest self, that it looked very, very different than what I believe Jesus wanted. And so I ended up, my visa ran out. I was there for 2 years. I had to come back, and didn't want to be a missionary anymore. And then I found myself in Kansas City again, kind of going back through my old things, my old closet, my old Walmart, my old church, and feeling very out of place. And so I relocated from the burbs of Olathe down to Kansas City, and left a lot of my old life behind, and I became a full-time musician, because I felt that my work as an artist and as a singer and as a curator of spaces was a very effective place, and had a very large impact on my audiences and on my collaborators. And then fast forward a few years, we have a global pandemic. I have a best friend from childhood that went through a lot of those same experiences with me, who's currently located in New York City. And he is a comedian and also a homosexual. And we have all these theological discussions about, or not theological, but just like discussions in general about our childhood theologies, about the things that we were raised in, and about religious trauma. And we felt that there, especially in a time when we could no longer run away from all of the things that we are afraid to talk about in normal conversation, such as racism, such as white supremacy. And this was like another one that impacted our lives. And I kind of looked around in a very cursory glance to my right and to my left, and I realized that there are millions of us out there in America alone who have experienced religious trauma to some degree. And within my own community, a handful of people who this is really impacted, but we're afraid to talk about it. And this is not something that you're hearing on the news. This is not something that you're that comes up outside of the walls of therapy. Probably it's not what you talk about at dinner. And so but he and I did all the time. And so we were just like, let's just record our conversations and see what happens. And maybe we'll have a couple guests if somebody wants to, talk about this. But the response has been really amazing and incredible. And mostly because there are so many people that have written in, strangers to me, strangers to Justin, who have experienced similar experiences and have felt so alone in those experiences. And just to hear that somebody else can share that space with them has changed their life and allowed them to have those maybe somewhat awkward conversations that you only have to have one time in order to live a life that is a little bit more free. And so, we have this podcast. We are on episode 17. We're doing it every week, which is pretty, kind of demanding, but at the same time, very rewarding. And we're going to keep doing it as long as we can. And even if, the cool thing about podcasts, as you probably well know, is that they kind of live there and they're accessible. It's like a library. And so even if we do need to take a pause because we're on tour or whatever, do seasons or however this is, because neither of us are, we didn't really have that much of a detailed plan and strategy when we started. We just were like, let's just record our conversations and see where it goes from there. And it's been an amazing ride.
Well, thank you for giving us some background on that. I have listened. You've got 16 episodes out, I think, as of this morning.
Yeah.
And I've probably listened to 6 of them. And I tried to pick the ones that were most provocative for me. Mm-hmm. Because I want my, and correct me if I give a description that doesn't fit. Okay.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure what I was going to get into when I was listening to it. So I start listening and for my audience, it is a critique of the Christianity that you grew up in.
Yes.
And particularly the two of you grew up in very similar Christian, evangelical, conservative environments, right? So you're very clear about trying to say, we're speaking about how we grew up.
Yeah.
And it sounded like both of your parents brought you up in these environments. Is that correct?
Yeah, his were a bit more severe than mine, but yes.
Okay, right. So you had parents that were bringing you up in these very conservative, evangelical environments. And Justin is Caucasian, you're African American, all right? Yep. And both of you were wrestling with your sexual identity.
Yeah.
And so you basically, at the age of, it sounds like both of you are about 30 now. I'm not sure if that's correct or not. Yep. And so basically at the age of 30, you're reflecting back on all of these Christian experiences that you had. And at times you're very snarky, right?
Yep. Yes.
At times you're very sarcastic.
Mm-hmm.
At times you can be, quite harsh in some of your critiques of the environments that you grew up in. Is that a fair assessment? So I kind of want my audience, if they run out there thinking they're going to get, a biblical inspiration or something, that's not what it is.
No.
And what's interesting to me is you tackle some of the sacred traditions of evangelicalism. So like you have a whole talk on fear tactics, which is the altar call, right?
Yeah.
And you have a whole conversation about the sexual purity culture that you guys grew up in. And you have a whole conversation about high key psychological warfare. And you have one on, it's called missionary style, which I was expecting something totally different, but you actually explore the whole missions thing because you were a missionary in Edinburgh. By the way, I was in Edinburgh for just 4 days one time. I did a speaking tour in the 1990s at Vineyard churches in England, but had never been to Scotland. And so I had a 4-day break, and me and my mom and dad was with me, and my ex-wife, and we all went up to Edinburgh for 4 days and loved it. Had a blast. It was a place I wish I could have spent a bunch more time.
Same.
Oh, wow. I just could have literally lost myself there in so many spaces.
Yeah.
There's quite a religious history there too, with the Reformation and Scottish Reformation, all that stuff. Very fascinating.
But it's a lot of sites where Christians beat up other Christians or killed other Christians.
That's all of Europe. Yeah, that's European Christian history, which is why so many don't go to church anymore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, very few people in Europe attend churches these days because of all that religious warfare history, right? So, well, so I found myself cringing at times, and I found myself like going, "Oh man!" Like in some ways, it felt like you were critiquing me, right? Because I started this church in 1990, and it grew to several thousand people, and we certainly practiced some, though not all. There. My version would have been a grace-based nuance of what you grew up in. So very much of what you grew up in, but very much grace-based. Like my vision when I started the church was to have a grace-based church for people outside the church, and accept anybody anywhere. I don't care where you've been or what you've done. You're welcome here. God loves you, and that really would have been my heartbeat from day one. I'm not saying that I always lived up to that, but it certainly was
and
at the core.
There's a bit of like it's the ideologies surrounding Western Christianity. It's bigger than any individual person or congregation, because it's this network, it's this web, it has all these tendrils, and I hear you, and I do like, and I have met people who are very much grace-based, but even in my brain, like, because I'm the same, right? And I was the same for a long time, and then I probably became more conservative, more severe. But I remember just feeling all of the people who I tried to get to come to church without understanding what kind of church I was talking about, that they already had these feelings of, you're judging me just in this conversation. So regardless of and I personally never said any of those things, but it's the whole like of the unit that has to have a rebrand if it's going to try to live up to this idea of everyone is welcome.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And what was interesting as I listened to you and Justin talk, I felt like both of you are very eloquent. I mean, you put your ideas together in really articulate ways. They're well thought out. They're very heartfelt. And even when you were critiquing, like I remember you saying on the altar call one, it was like, maybe we should give a reverse altar call and save people from Christianity. And, I thought, that, like I gave a lot of altar calls. Okay. So like, I remember you and Justin going, did you get one? Did you get one? And I gave thousands of them. Right. And so, but I thought about that when you said that, and I thought, there's so many, think about it. There's so many Christians who don't act hardly anything like Jesus. And so there's a lot of people that need to be saved from a Christianity that doesn't look anything like Jesus.
Yeah, and saved from all of the shame that came from that experience, and saved from, the culture around America in general at large, the around choosing convenience or even materialism. I mean, I'm not saying that what is considered secular humanism, to use a phrase that we're familiar with, I'm not saying that I'm like, 100% in that court either, because I think what my heart is looking for is a spiritual community, is some kind of sense of my 80 to 100 years of life matter. I want to matter, and I want those years to matter, and I believe that they do. And so, because some of the stuff that we talk about in apologetics and in logic-based kind of reasoning is like, if you don't have if there is no God, then you have no purpose. And I don't believe, I'm not there either. I don't know what or why we're here. And I want to be like furiously curious to find out or to learn, and to always be learning, and to always be fascinated, and to always be open to more and to more information. And my experience in the church would not allow me to believe that we're here with no purpose, or that we're here without the ability to have deep and meaningful existence with one another, and the connectedness that we have in one another. I mean, I used to be a part of like really profound prophetic communities, right? And so like, and we would speak beautiful words over one another, and things that would seemingly, without any other reason, come out of completely thin air, but be spot on. And what that leads me to believe in these days is that it's a part of the human mechanism to understand one another deeply without words. And that maybe this isn't something that should be chalked up to only spirituality, but it's just a part of the human condition. And that we should all be operating in this with or without speaking in tongues, or being laying out in the spirit, or having responded to an altar call. I think it is something that is inside of us. That's my only logical conclusion. And so, I mean, I do have a pretty harsh critique of the churches that I grew up in. And the reason why I feel the need to speak so harshly is because I haven't heard anybody from inside say any of these things before. And I've been out for a while, so maybe there isn't, or maybe there is, but my biggest surprise is to hear people who are still actively involved in their churches, who are listening and who are grateful. And that was never anything within our realm of possibilities for what was going to happen through the podcast. But it's been quite a ride.
Yes. Oh man, so when I listen, there's so many conversations we could have. It could go on for hours, and it'd be fun. I would really enjoy, and maybe we'll have more. But I want to focus it a little bit here. So,
sure.
When I listen to you guys talk over the course of 6 episodes, so I've listened in the last week about 6 hours of you guys having conversations.
That's
so I'm
crazy.
dreaming about your guys' conversations now, right? I'm going to bed and I'm hearing your words, so it's funny. And then I've listened to your albums over and over again too. So, so I got Calvin running through my head these days. So anyway, and not John Calvin either. So, anyway, but nonetheless, as I listened to you guys, one of the things that I heard was how much shame you had growing up in these environments with your own sexuality. And I understand shame, Calvin. I've shared with you some of what I went through the last couple of years, and I was so deep into my own shame, felt, oh gosh, like so dark that I wasn't suicidal, but I was a step above it.
Yeah, that feeling where you want to dissolve.
I just wake up every morning hating myself.
Yeah, and I wish you could just disappear.
Yes, exactly. Small.
Like you don't want to have to endure the pain or like the mess, but you just want to evaporate.
I hate that. And hearing you guys talk about that and how, to some degree, I mean, maybe to big degrees, your own families and religious environments accentuated. Mm-hmm. So like think about just any of us that grow up with our sexuality, no matter what, no matter how we identify, it's confusing, right? For young kids to grow up and figure sexuality out, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, especially when it's taboo in every form.
Exactly. And then to be conflicted with the messages that are coming at you all the time, and then to feel shame at the very core of your being and the religious trauma that created. And so what I heard from you guys both over the course of listening was like, in your heart of hearts, if you could rescue kids out there in all of these churches that might be going through a similar experience of shame and trauma, that you would do it.
Yeah, in a heartbeat.
And
Absolutely.
I appreciate that heart. And I have to think that there's a lot of grace-based, loving religious leaders who might listen, or they be pastors of Christian churches or mosques or temples or whatever stripe they might be. And I think I would love for pastors all over the place or religious leaders to listen to you guys, to get a little window into religious trauma.
Yeah.
And how we can not create those environments. Let's talk just a little bit about religious trauma, because it's a real deal. Mm-hmm. People go through it all different kinds of ways. Your particular trauma, experience. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, trauma is like it's not something that is so easy and cut and dry and black and white. It's everyone has it, and it's kind of tailor made to each individual. And so it's not something that it's like we can just have a blanket paintbrush and say, okay, well, I didn't do X, Y, and Z, so you didn't experience trauma, from a pastor or from a parent's point of view. But it's like, if it wasn't one thing, it's probably another. And the point is like listening to one another and being able to have an open dialogue and what is trauma to one person wouldn't necessarily be trauma to another person. So it's like, it's something that I think should be in the arsenal of every religious institution, of every religious teacher or mentor or parent. I think that we need to be able to have language and to not be afraid of really stepping into that space and holding that space and creating that space if it doesn't create itself naturally, to be able to address those things. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I've never even been to therapy yet. I'm going to, but I am somebody who explores these things a lot and tries to open up those conversations within my just interpersonal relationships, and that came as a result of being in Bible studies and small groups and stuff for most of my formative life, and so I just know that there's a lot of effective things that happen in those spaces. I'm crying at the altar calls. I mean, it's just like such a specific depiction of that. Is like sometimes people will respond to altar calls because of all of the shame that they're feeling, and I want to be relieved of that, which is kind of this like self-fulfilling prophecy. Would people feel so much shame that they would have to respond in this way with all of this emotion if there weren't people telling them that they were messed up all the time? I don't know.
Shame-based anything I just don't think it's good for the human soul.
Right.
I think grace-based everything.
Yeah.
This is where it's at. So you asked me, just might have been yesterday, if in all of my religious training, if I'd ever had a course on religious trauma. And my answer was no. Mm-hmm. And so, think about it, I'm 60, and I went to one of the largest religious institutions, universities, for a bachelor's degree, majored in religion, in preparation for ministry there at Baylor. And then I went to one of the largest seminaries in the world in Fort Worth, Texas, Southwestern Seminary. Masters of Theology, they called it Master of Divinity. Mm-hmm. I always thought that's a funny name for it. Anyway, fancy. Master of Divinity. Anyway, how can you ever be that, right? Anyway, then I did a Doctor of Ministry at Fuller Theological in Pasadena, which is one of the premier evangelical institutions in the world. Then I was working on a PhD in the Hebrew Bible, just short of my dissertation, working on my dissertation when I went to rehab a couple of years ago. And never once did I have a course on religious trauma or how various people can experience trauma religiously, how we might either avoid creating that or at the same time help people come out of it. Right? And so, my answer was no. And then we started talking about I mean, there's a huge need there.
Just imagine if the global church shifted their narrative that they were providing free therapy for religious trauma instead of teaching the stuff that they're normally teaching. I think their churches would be full.
You know, I had a mentor say when I was younger, if you preach to people's pain, you'll never lack an audience. Mm-hmm. And I might change that word from preach to just if you care and listen and love and talk about wonderful ways to heal from pain, you probably won't ever lack an audience.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have a feeling. I know all my therapists that I refer people to now are full for the next 3 or 4 months because everybody coming through this pandemic is like just all the mental health issues are off the charts right now and trending in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to toss a couple of ideas to you because there's a couple of times where you and Justin say, well, wouldn't it be cool if there was a Christianity that... And then you say some things, and I'm like going, "Oh, I could be on with that one," you know. And so one of them was like, "What if Jesus saved us?" You know, like not if we're just trying to scare people out of hell, but what if Jesus saved us from? And I think Justin said this, like not loving ourselves, or saved us from not loving ourselves, or not loving others, or not loving what we're all, you know, this greater, higher power thing that we're all connected to, that kind of a thing. And what if Jesus saved us from like self-destructive things and helped us to love others, love ourselves, and be connected to something that's loving and greater, that's bigger than us. I go, I'd buy into that.
It sounds almost familiar.
Spirituality adventures. I like to say spirituality is connection to self, others, and something greater than you that's loving and caring, or belonging to self, others, and something that's greater than you that's loving and caring. So, yeah. And then I wanted to run this by you. So when we guys were talking about the Great Commission, and I was thinking about Jesus. You know, there's 4 versions of the Great Commission at the end of each gospel, but the most famous one is the Matthew chapter 28 one, where Jesus says, "Go into all the world and make disciples. You know, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I've commanded you." So I was thinking about this as I was listening to you guys. What if we talked about the Great Commission like, go and make disciples. Disciples are learners. So when you described how you valued learning, openness, curiosity, I actually wrote that down as one of my core values just recently. Curious, open, learner, hungry to just learn and grow, right? So disciples are learners, students, basically, you know. So go and make learners of all the nations everywhere. And then there's this Trinitarian formula, baptizing them, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And there's a my favorite book on the Trinity is by Richard Rohr. It's called The Divine Dance. Beautiful book. And I'd encourage any of my listeners to read it, and you as well. I mean, I think you would love many, many parts of it. But he pictures the Trinity as a community of love, a community of dance and love that is both one, unified, and diverse. So a community of love that's both unified and diverse. So, and baptism means immersion. So what if we made learners, open, curious people who are immersed into a community of loving dance that's diverse and unified, and that we taught people how to live by the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Jesus. Love your neighbor.
The upside down kingdom.
Interesting.
Yeah, I love it. I would love that. And that's kind of what, you know, some of the things that we're also trying to explore in the podcast is that because there's not been a lot of middle ground. I think if you are somebody who has experienced trauma from the church, or disagree with the way that things are conducted inside of local churches, then you tend to not want to look at anything that Jesus said and throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think we're trying to create a space where let's actually do the thing that we were taught never to do, and let's cherry pick. And at least let's find out, like, what of those experiences are we still using in our life that we find beneficial, and what are some of the teachings of Jesus or the Psalms or wherever, you know, in the scriptures that have proven themselves to be worthy in our lives from personal experience. And let's use those things, because if they're good, they're good, and if they're good to us, then that's why not? So and also to have that be in a way that we're not pretending to be anything that we're not. And I think a lot of my life I wasn't pretending, but I definitely had to self-edit a lot. And code switch is a phrase that we have these days, but to use different language when I was around certain people or addressing certain things, and I want to be able to be a holy individual in all the senses of those words, as somebody who is participating in a romantic relationship with a man, as somebody who likes to have alcoholic drinks every once in a while, as somebody who hasn't been into a church in several years now, or at least not in a regular sense. And how do I, as this individual, as this artist who wears makeup and glitter and earrings and paints my nails, how do I get to have a holy experience in this body as it is, and to not change things in order to be more culturally acceptable by white suburban churches that I was raised in? And am I still a holy individual? Am I still an eternal being? Am I still somebody who has communed with the Father? And I believe in a lot of ways I was, at least at what this again, greater being who is loving and benevolent and who gives a sense of belonging. I have experienced that for years, all the time. And I believe that those experiences were real experiences, to the sense that I was connecting with something greater than me. And I don't want to resent those parts of my life. And I think a lot of people in the resenting communities would want me to question all of those things. And so and sure, I can question that too, and allow that to be a safe space to do so. So I just I want to be able to look at all of these things kind of objectively and anthropologically, to understand the inner workings of it, and what is beneficial, and what is what can be left aside, and how do we move forward as a society and as people and as individuals in a way that is healthy and sustainable, and brings us into a more empathetic future.
You're so eloquent, really, and you word things beautifully. So that's amazing. So here's an interesting thing. Everybody cherry picks the scriptures. Everybody.
Fair enough.
I could sit down with my seminary professors who we know the Bible pretty well, right? I could teach seminary. I'm qualified. I'm credentialed. Okay, so I could sit down with any of them and point out hundreds of passages in the Bible that they ignore. Now, they would always have good reasons for why they ignore these and not these.
Yeah.
But there's a rhyme or reason to why people ignore some and put more emphasis on others. And there are cultural lenses for all of that. And the Eastern Orthodox Church has very different lenses and looks at scriptures very differently, and emphasizes some and de-emphasizes others very differently from the Western Church, right? There's all kinds of streams out there in the Christian tradition over 2,000 years of history, just like there are all kinds of streams. I've worked in the Arab Muslim world for over a decade. There's multiple streams there. There's multiple streams in the Jewish faith. There's multiple streams in the Buddhist faith. There's all kinds of streams with every tradition that you have, the faith tradition that you find out there. And so I think people do need to step out or try to step outside their own lens and, listening to people, having conversations with people, not trying to just debate and win an argument.
Right.
But open-heartedly loving people because they're created in the image of God, however you want to say that. They're people of worth and dignity. And we have common connections because of who we're, this humanity.
Because of what we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really beautiful when we can connect at the heart level. Yeah. I've found that in recovery groups where you sit around a room you could sit around with a Christian, a Buddhist, an atheist, anybody, any kind of lifestyle, and everybody shares about their brokenness, and the Spirit moves, and there's a connection to that honest, vulnerable authenticity at the very human level that's as tangible as any Spirit moving I ever witnessed anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, when I listened to your worship podcast, I was actually caught off guard because I'd listened to some of the others first, and they were quite snarky, sarcastic, and so I'd kind of gotten into the rhythm of that. And then when you and Justin talked about worship, all of a sudden there was a different tone. You weren't nearly as harsh in your critique of worship music or some of, and you wanted to be a worship leader, and you were a worship leader, and you wanted that to be your lifelong career, and that was a big part of your whole identity from the time you were very, very young, as if I'm understanding right.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably 13 or so when I had made that a priority. That is quite young.
And so it was very evident that there's still aspects of that you hold on to and that you cherish, which you kind of expressed that in a broader way just a moment ago.
Yeah.
But how you're trying to hold on to some things, and maybe just express a little bit about what you're holding on to from that experience with worship music.
Yeah.
And worship leading.
It's also reminds me of what you were just saying in the recovery group, when you open up, when you tell your story, when you are vulnerable about pain, when you're vulnerable about being, about not being complete or that you're still in a place where you're recovering from things, or you're becoming who you're becoming, and in the space of worship. In churches, we enter that space on a regular basis, and at least as a worship leader, I took my role very importantly, as it is my job to facilitate an experience, to get people to encounter an uncreated God coming from wherever they came from, having no musical background, as fast as possible. And to get everyone on the same page as fast as possible. So how do we do that? And this, every encounter with this uncreated God is a life-changing experience, and can be something that changes the narrative of that person's life from now for the rest of eternity. So of course I'm going to take that like it's a big deal, because it is, and it was. And I've now adopted those same principles as an artist and as a man, as a person, that we can have those same kinds of encounters with the person who's checking out your groceries, or your bank teller, or the person who's serving you at the restaurant. Like, there is opportunity in every human connection to change the narrative of that person, or to invite them into a space that could change the rest of their life for the better. And as a musician, people come to my shows having not maybe this is they got a babysitter. They get a babysitter once a year, and they came out to my show and they got all dressed up and they spent some money and they rented a dress and a tuxedo and they went to dinner beforehand and they've got drinks afterwards and the hour, 2 hours that they have with me is not something that they get to do on a weekly basis like we would do in church. It's not something that they get to do very often, and we've all been at shows or conferences or concerts or festivals that where we had life-changing experiences in those places. Shows, festivals, concerts, they are all just as much of a ritual, or have the opportunity to be just as much of a ritual as some of the most ritualistic things that we do and that we did in the church. And so I take a lot of the kind of feel-good things from weddings and funerals and worship nights with the candles and the mood setting and the incense and the sharing, the testifying, to say that I have been broken, and either through song or through word, to try to share something in me every time I'm on stage that feels scary, like we would do in accountability groups, but do it on a public forum. And my question is always, will my audience receive me? Will in kind of like in parallel with will God still love me if I confess these things, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we would experience in church when somebody would testify, when they would say, I'm being led through this thing, or this is my experience, or whatever. And like you were saying in the recovery groups, like this is my hang up, the Spirit would always fall. And I believe the same thing is happening in my shows, not in the same exact sense, but something that feels similar. And so, I absolutely believe that there's something very human in this experience, and I feel very excited to be able to provide those experiences now for people who may have no other way to have those.
It's beautiful. So when I listened to the worship podcast, you did 3 different worship songs on the podcast, and I was moved on every one of them. It really touched me because I hadn't heard those songs in quite a while myself, and so that is very, very good. So I wanted to ask you, and we're going to do a second part together where we talk and focus more on your musical career and your artistic performance career and all that stuff, which people are going to be amazed if they don't know you to dive into that. And I really want to encourage everybody to stick with you and experience your music and performance and all of that, because it's so rich and so beautiful. But I'd ask you just to close us with this first segment with one of your songs. And by the way, you started on guitar, right, as a child, just so people know, but then 10 years ago you picked up the harp, and you've become this has become one of your identifying features, is the spiritual nature of Calvin and the harp. It's very cool. All right.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
Beautiful. Hey, all right. Yeah, I shouldn't clap into the mic like that probably. Anyway, but beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, thanks everybody tuning in to this episode of Spirituality Adventures. Hope to see you next time, and we'll be doing a part 2 with Calvin. Thank you so much, Calvin, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for tuning in. Remember to visit our support page at www.spiritualityadventures.com. If you like what you heard, be sure to share it and leave a comment. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Harp Media Production.